Grüß, willkommen in einem aufregenden video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 1 of my organisational series of videos. In this video I'll be covering the Swedish 30-year war army of 1631, specifically during the Battle of Bitchute. This video will cover the Swedish Army in some detail, perhaps more accurate than would typically be provided in a non-academic video or source. I'll assume viewers are familiar with the 30-year war and how Sweden became involved in the war, and I will dive right into the specific organisation of the Swedish Army, as well as providing some details on the troops, uniform and equipment. The reason why this video exists is I'm in the process, or at least I was in the process, of building up a Protestant and Imperial army to wargame the 30-year war period. This video will not be focusing on gaming, but instead will present the historical research I was required to undertake in order to understand what type of troops I needed to purchase and how they should be painted up. So, for those who are not gamers, do not be concerned. This is not a gaming video, it's purely a historical video. The Swedish army on the eve of the Battle of Bitchute consisted of 520 men, of which the bulk were German. The army was loosely organised into 3 wings, left, centre and right, and a reserve. The artillery, while separate here, was scattered across the army, as was the practice of the period. The left wing consisted of 5 cavalry regiments and an infantry regiment. Most cavalry of the period were called cuirassiers, and all these regiments were classed as cuirassier regiments. In most cases, if not all, these were German formations, although some Swedish officers would have been present. All German troops were trained in the unique tactics the Swedish employed. A quick overview of cuirassiers. The cuirassiers were the heavy cavalry. The name originates from cuirass, which was the name of the armoured protection they wore. During the 17th century, it became too ungainly, too awkward basically, to wear a full cuirass. Instead, a light cuirass came into use, plus a helmet instead of the older full head protection. The cuirassiers were armed with a rapier, or sword, and a handgun. Fully equipped cuirassiers were quite heavy, so they needed large horses to carry them. A quick note about the organisation. I took the formation strengths from 2 sources, Wiki and the S&T magazine article on the Battle of Bitchute. I have no idea how accurate they are, but while they generally align, they do conflict in a number of areas, which I will cover next. In terms of organisation, each cavalry regiment was organised into companies. In between the regiment and company, we also had squadrons. As far as I can work out, 2 companies made up a squadron. According to one source from Hans Hollmann, the tactical unit used by the cavalry was the squadron. A cavalry regiment of 1,000 men was organised into 4 squadrons of 250 horsemen each. The squadrons were organised into 2 companies of 125 men each. This must have represented an ideal strength, and the strengths present were about half these values. One area where my sources differed was with Horn's regiment. In one source, this consisted of 8 cuirassier companies. In another, half consisted of dragoons. I'm uncertain which is the correct answer, but this allows me to segue into another cavalry type, the dragoons. The dragoons were formerly mounted infantry. They travelled on horseback to the battlefield, but they fought as foot soldiers. As mounted infantry, they were a very mobile unit. It happened that dragoons fought as cavalry in battles. However, this was a type of warfare they weren't trained for, and would or could end up in a disaster if they tried. An example of a battle where dragoons successfully were used as cavalry was the Battle of Lund in 1676. There was a single infantry regiment in the left wing, which was spread around the cavalry in a form of combined arms manner, or in the form of a combined arms manner. My sources here also differ, with one saying 100 men and the other 1,000 men. I have gone with the 1,000 men option, as this actually seems more logical when you compare it with the other regiments. From my Hans Hollmann source, the organisation of the Swedish infantry is as follows. The smallest tactical unit used by the infantry in battle was a battalion. A regiment of 1,200 soldiers had 8 companies of 150 men. These were formed into 2 battalions of 600 men each. Each company had 6 korporalskap, or corporal ships, of 24 soldiers and 1 corporal, in total 25 men. In some rare cases, the term squadron is used for infantry formations, so I assume this could be a half battalion. The Swedish had 8,572 musket-armed infantry and 3,440 pike-armed infantry, so most of the infantry were musketeers, with some pike mixed in. Possibly 1/3 were pike-armed. I lack specific cavalry regiment images, but this was the ideal cuirassier in 1631 on the left. The Swedish lacked armour, so this would have been rare in the Swedish army, at least while they were in Germany. On the right I am showing a Swedish cuirassier, who in this case is a noble and is correctly fully armoured. This type of cavalry would have been more common in the imperial armies. This would be a more accurate view of Swedish cuirassiers, or actually German cuirassiers in Swedish service during the 30-Year War in Germany. In this case, the cuirassiers would have discharged their pistols and would have then charged into contact using their swords, which was a very effective tactic. Swedish innovation which caused the imperialists a great deal of problems. This image here shows a good range of cuirassiers, from the heavily armoured, if rare, on the left, to the less armoured in the centre and reasonably unarmoured on the right. Moving over to the dragoons, of which 4 companies may have been included in the left wing, we have this possible depiction. I personally feel this is an unrealistic view of how dragoons operated, as they were rarely used in cavalry charges, particularly fielding what looks like a pike there, or lance. There was one successful example of such a charge, and this image may be representing this, but for the most part the dragoons dismounted and fought as infantry. Dismounted, the dragoons may have looked like the person, or the soldier, that you see on the left here. The image on the right shows another dragoon, which does seem to be ready to act as cavalry. However, this image most likely represented historically accurate dragoons during the 30-Year War in Germany. The foot in the foreground would have been a dismounted dragoon, and the 3 mounted dragoons were various types of different dragoons. This image here shows the dragoons in their normal fighting mode, on foot and firing muskets. I lack any good information on Waldstein's regiment, apart from its name and that it had a strength of 1,000 men. This would have been a mix of musketeers and pikemen, similar to those shown here, except they would have likely not used the colour red. Moving over to the right wing, we see actual Swedish formations, as well as Finnish, Latvian, Estonians, and of course more Germans. In some of my sources, some of the regiments are described as musketeers rather than infantry. My guess is these were fully armed with muskets, and as this formation was a reserve regiment, this may be accurate. Some of my sources also describe these, what looks like regimental size formations, as squadrons with 4 companies each, and the type, of course, in both sources is cavalry. The actual Swedish cavalry may have been lighter than cuirassiers and may have looked similar to these horsemen. Other sources indicate the commander of these formations normally led something called hakapelita, excuse my Finnish, which is a term used to describe light cavalry, normally Finnish. This image is of a Swedish army's hakapelita, which for light cavalry seems well armoured. The horses were supposed to have possessed significant endurance and may have been specifically trained in order to basically be unusual compared to other normal horses in terms of endurance. To confuse matters even further, there is a specific Finnish light horse regiment in this TONE, which may have been a hakapelita. Most of the actual Swedish cavalry is simply described as horse in most of my sources. This image likely shows what may have been Swedish cavalry, lightly armoured and trained to close with the enemy, which was an unusual and uniquely Swedish tactic, at least at this point in the war. The rest of the formations I will cover come from the centre wing. In this case we have the rather famous Yellow Regiment or Brigade and the Red and Blue Regiments. The name reflects the colours used by the regiments, or at least the regiments or the soldiers within the regiments. The uniforms had these colours on it in some way, shape or form. These images likely show what the troops of the Red Regiment looked like, although in this case this is showing the Norrland territorial regimental troops. The Red Regiment was a German regiment which was raised in 1624 or 1625. All troops normally had a red coat. Here we see troops from the Blue Regiment, which were also German. This was raised in 1624, renamed Old Blue in 1634, and all the troops had a blue coat. This image shows troops from the Yellow Regiment. The Yellow Regiment was a mixed Swedish and German regiment. The Yellow Regiment was initially raised in 1624, but only was called Yellow from 1626 onwards. What I personally found rather surprising was that we see lots of Scottish troops in the Swedish Army, in this case Scots Brigade, which apparently was reasonably famous. This represents a trooper from Robert Monro's Scottish Regiment. Hans Brigade was mainly a Swedish formation, as was Oxenstierna Brigade. The standard Swedish troops were issued with a grey uniform, although as a campaign continued you may find the troops in whatever they could find. The pants could sometimes be brown, but was otherwise also grey. This image shows a Swedish arquebusier on the left and a Swedish musketeer on the right. The centre of the Swedish army was divided into a forward and reserve, with the reserves consisting of the remaining German brigades, with some Scots thrown in for good measure. The German Green Regiment had, you guessed it, green uniforms. The regiment was raised in 1627, and while it's unclear if a green coat was standard, some troops were clothed in green somewhere. The Orange Regiment contained orange in the uniform. The Orange Regiment was raised in 1630. The Black Regiment, as you could guess it, had its theme the colour black. The Swedish raised a total of 4 black regiments, 3 in 1629 and the 4th in 1630. There was a White Regiment, and unfortunately I do not possess any image of the White Regiment's troops. But I have to assume white was the common colour that they wore. The Swedes also raised 1 white regiment in 1630. Not shown in the TONE of Breintefeld, or the Battle of Breintefeld, the Swedes also possessed a brown regiment, which was raised in 1630. I lack an image of the troops in this regiment, but have to assume they wore a brown coat or had brown somewhere on their uniform. The pikemen was the lowest ranked unit or soldier, but nonetheless were very respected at the beginning of the war and well paid at the beginning of the war. This was most likely because the pikeman was at the head of the front of any army. Most of the pikemen were new young men who had hardly any combat experience. They learned how to fight from scratch. The German phrase von der Pike auf describes this well. Because the pikeman stood directly at the front, he was usually given a suit of armour, at least at the beginning of the 30-Year War. The surviving originals of pike armour shows that the quality was rather inferior. Most pikemen also wore a helmet, like a morion or cabernest, or caberset. My apologies for the poor pronunciation. The morion was rather old-fashioned type of helmet, most common in the 16th century, mostly related to the Spanish conquistadors. The cabernet was more standard in early to mid-17th century. The pike was the pikeman's main weapon, was mainly used to defend against cavalry. It had a diameter of 3 to 6 centimetres and was up to 6 metres long with an iron tip. As a sidearm, they carried either a rapier or a short sword. The sword was very popular with the pikemen because it was shorter and therefore did not interfere so much in the tight terrico. In the course of the war, the pikeman lost his status and there were fewer of them. The musketeer took over because they were more flexible. The term musketeer comes from the musket, and the main weapon of this type of mercenary or soldier. The same applied to the arquebus. Along with the pikemen, they made up the bulk of the terrico, my apologies for my Spanish. While the pikemen protected the musketeer or arquebusier from the cavalry, the latter fired his shot on command and retreated to reload. The reloading process could take between 30 seconds and 2 minutes. The musket was a firearm and a front loader, i.e. it was loaded with black powder and bullet from the front of the weapon. There were models with different firing mechanisms, the most common being the matchlock. This was very simple and moved a glowing match to the bassinet to release the shot. The bassinet is a small opening loaded with fine powder that ignited the powder inside the barrel. In addition to the matchlock musket, there was also the wheel-lock musket. The wheel-lock was more complicated and thus more expensive and was not as reliable. The wheel-lock had a wheel that had to be wound up so when the trigger was pulled, A pyrite stone would hit the ignition powder and ignite it. The wheel-like musket is more likely to be found among the nobility as a hunting weapon than on the battlefield. The black powder was stored in small capsules, made normally of turned wood, attached to a belt. There were 8 or 14 capsules hanging from the so-called bandolier, or the belt around the soldier. Each capsule contained exactly the amount of black powder needed for one shot. The bullets were stored in a small leather bag, which was also attached to a bandolier. The fine powder from the bassinet was stored in a powder flask. The musketeer, or arquebusser, could also have a harness, but usually only a breastplate, with or without a back plate, and without tassels, thigh protection basically. Their side weapon was a sword or rapier, with or without a left-handed dagger. And so I come to a close of my episode 1 of my organisational series of videos, in this case covering the Swedish 30-year War Army period. In the end, I decided not to go down this particular path. I'm retired, I don't have that much money, and I've got too many other armies and not enough money to go down yet another period. But I have to admit, I think there would be great interest. I would be very interested in this period if I had the money and the lack of other armies to occupy me to go down. Anyway, alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem in der